In the last lecture, we looked at how the rise of Constantine as a Christian emperor and the Christian empire that he inaugurated led to changes in the way that the church functioned, and in particular, exacerbated divisions that grew out of arguments and conflicts about theology and the structure of the administration of Christian communities. But this isn't the only way that the changing dynamics of the empire of Constantine affected elements of Roman life. So today, we're going to focus on the ways in which this emerging Christian society impacted Roman cultural life. And most of our attention is going to be paid to cultural events in the Greek-speaking part of the empire. In a way, this will build on and kind of continue the discussion of the second sophistic that we saw earlier. But to introduce this topic, I think it's best actually to begin by a story that's told by an Eastern military figure who moves to Rome and writes a history in Latin. This is Ammianus Marcellinus. Now, Ammianus is an incredibly fascinating figure because he grew up speaking Greek. His native language was Greek, but the history that he wrote, he was born in Antioch, he served in the army, he spoke Greek growing up. His Latin was very, very good, and the history that he wrote was written in Latin and performed before audiences in Rome. And so Ammianus, in some way, emphasizes the intense continuity and the growing together that we see of people from the East and from the West. He is a person of both backgrounds. He's a native Greek speaker who is perfectly conversant in Latin, and also someone who is eventually by the 380s, a fixture in Roman elite life in the city of Rome as a Latin performer and author. Now, Ammianus's biggest gripe in his discussion of cultural life in Rome actually speaks about the experiences of people like himself. He talks about how visiting intellectuals are treated when they actually come to the capital. So Ammianus says, now, if you come to Rome as a respectable stranger from the provinces to pay a first call on a man who prides himself on his ample means, you'll be received like a long-lost friend. And if, after relying upon this friendly reception, you repeat your visit the next day, you will find yourself left standing like an unknown and unwelcome intruder. Finally, however, you are recognized and included in his circle of dependents. But if after you wait upon him without a break for 3 years, and then absent yourself for 3 days, you'll be back in the same position. You'll spend your whole life paying vain homage to this booby. Now, what Ammianus is describing here is a very real thing. What we see here is a picture of how people travel and how they move between various cities as part of this elite class. And Ammianus describes a situation that is something his readers would be very familiar with. To those living in his society, Ammianus's passage makes a great deal of sense. Now, if you were visiting somebody from, say, Antioch and you were coming to Rome, you would not show up unannounced. You would have with you a letter of introduction from somebody who was a mutual friend. And generally, if you were looking to move from a city like Antioch to a city like Rome, you would come with a bunch of these letters of introduction from all of the people in Antioch who you knew who had connections to people in Rome. And you would show up at this house, you would present the letter of introduction that said, in essence, you know who I am, and I am vouching for this person. And then you, as the visitor, would speak to the host, and you would get to know each other. And the host would decide whether the relationship was something they wished to continue to pursue. And so what Ammianus is describing here is something that is very, very real. If you come from the provinces and you have one of these letters of introduction to a prominent person in Rome, they will listen to you. But what's supposed to happen is if you're received in a friendly way initially, this is supposed to begin a longer relationship, a genuine friendship. But what Ammianus says is this doesn't actually happen in Rome anymore. If you come as a respectable person from the provinces, you will be received like you're supposed to be received, but this doesn't mean anything. It isn't a permanent relationship. It isn't anything that gives you a long-standing connection to that person. Instead, it's very ephemeral, and people in Rome are not, in a way, living up to the sorts of ideals that are supposed to bind intellectuals, cultured people, and elites across the entire empire. If the empire really is a giant state full of Romans, those relationships between Romans that transcend the geographical spaces of the empire should matter. They should be enduring. And what Ammianus is saying is, in Rome, this isn't the case. This is not something that is actually honored in the way that's supposed to be honored. And so Ammianus's complaint here is basically that people are willing to take on these provincials, these clients, as you will, and they're willing to have them be recognized when, for example, that person holds a public event or they have a party, and they want to show off all of the interesting people they know. You, as their client, as their associate, you're supposed to show up. And what's supposed to happen then is if you need something from that person, they will reciprocate. But what Ammianus is saying is, if you show up as the client or dependent of one of these prominent Romans, you do your part, but they won't do their part. And you'll continue to show up again and again and again, but these people will not do what you need for them. And this is particularly important to Ammianus. Because Ammianus is one of these provincials. He's somebody we know, shows up in Rome, he has substantial connections to elites, he builds relationships with them, and he is very aware that this dynamic exists. And it has consequences. Ammianus says, not long ago, when foreigners were banished from the city because a famine was expected, no respite whatever was granted to professors of liberal arts, though they were very few in number. While at the same time, the hangers-on of actresses and those who posed as such for the occasion, together with 3,000 dancers and their choruses, and the same number of dancing instructors were allowed to remain. And so what Ammianus is saying here is he's describing an event in 384, when the city of Rome, its food supply was disrupted, and it didn't look like there would be enough food for everybody in Rome. And the way that the food distributions in Rome tended to work is people who had residence in the city were given access to government-subsidized food. But people who didn't have residency permits, in essence, they were not supposed to have that access. And with food short, the people who didn't have those residency permits were told to leave the city. And what Ammianus is basically saying is there were exceptions to this. And these exceptions indicate who is important in the mind of the people running the city of Rome. And who was important in the mind of the people running the city of Rome were actresses and the associates of actresses and dancers and singers. But people like Ammianus, people like historians and people like teachers and people with cultural skills of that sort, they were forced to leave when these dancers and actors were allowed to stay. Now, Ammianus continues along this line. He says that the professors and intellectuals are kicked out of the city because to many of these Roman elites, men of learning and sobriety are shunned as bringers of bad luck who have nothing to contribute. And so in this state of affairs, the few houses which once had the reputation of being centers of serious culture are now given over to the trivial pursuit of passive idleness. Men put themselves to the school of the singer instead of the philosopher, to the theatrical producer rather than the teacher of oratory, and the libraries are like tombs, permanently shut. And so what you have here, if you take Ammianus at face value, is a statement of cultural decline. Remember the discussion that we had about Marcus Aurelius and how Marcus Aurelius handled intellectuals in the city of Rome. They weren't kicked out, they were honored. They weren't shunted to the side, they were brought into the center. And Marcus spent his time interacting and patronizing with them. And Ammianus, of course, knew this. The first part of Ammianus' history actually talks about Rome at that moment. It talks about Rome under the Antonines. That part is unfortunately lost, so we can't say whether this is exactly hearkening back to Ammianus' own discussion of Marcus Aurelius, but it certainly is hearkening back to conditions that everybody acknowledged existed in the late 2nd century. And so by the late 4th century, Ammianus is saying those conditions are no longer there. But we also have to take this with a grain of salt. If you read Ammianus literally, you take Ammianus at his word, yes, you do have evidence that you can use to say that there's a cultural decline in the city of Rome. But we have to understand what this text is. This is a text written for intellectuals and people who are elite Romans who are interested in the kinds of things Ammianus is talking about. And we have a letter written by Libanius, a figure from Syria who Ammianus knew. And in that letter, Libanius talks about Ammianus' history as something that is all the rage among the cultured elite in the city of Rome. So much so that Ammianus gave public readings of the history to audiences in the city of Rome. And so what we have to understand is Ammianus is making this critique, but he's making this critique to people in the city of Rome who are listening to this. And so what Ammianus is in essence saying is, everybody else behaves this way, but you're here. You're listening to me. You respect me. You respect the kinds of things that I do. You are the special people who continue to uphold the values of culture and the values of Romanness that actually matter. And so Ammianus is making a critique of how Roman society treats these people, treats intellectuals, treats rhetoricians, treats philosophers. But he's framing this critique in such a way that it actually affirms the virtue of the people who are reading his work. And so the critique works in two fashions. It attacks people who don't agree with Ammianus, but the people who do agree with Ammianus are the only people who are reading this anyway. And when they read this, or when they hear Ammianus perform this, Ammianus is reaffirming the value of the kind of commitment to culture that they have made. And so what we can see here is that high literary culture is not dying in Rome, despite the protests of people like Ammianus. What we actually are seeing is something that's a little more complicated. There are different versions of this culture. And people who are interested, for example, in theater or in mimes or in singing, they have a spot too. They have a place too. And so culture is diversifying. What qualifies as culture is diversifying. And Ammianus' idea of high culture is something that speaks to one particular brand of this culture. But it should not be understood as just simply a statement of decline. It instead is a statement of complexity. And the reason that high literary culture is not dying out is because of the role that education played in this Constantinian society. Education then, as now, was about taking an individual person, who is a young person usually, and teaching him or her the social and intellectual skills necessary to function in society. And in an ancient context, the society that people with the highest level education were supposed to function in is this elite society that Ammianus is talking about. Now, Roman education usually had two tracks. The first was a track that was available to lots and lots of people. It was a track that basically taught basic literacy, enough to read a document, sign your name, maybe read a law or something posted in the forum. And many Romans, even in the provinces, had this. But this is not the kind of literary culture that Ammianus is talking about. The second type of education was this real classical education that had a legitimate kind of cultural valence. This was an education that taught students to read well, to speak effectively, and to compose speeches like those given by sophists. And it began with the study of grammar, it moved on to public speaking, and eventually it came to include the study of philosophy as well. And this type of education was in some sense a scarce item because it was too expensive and too time consuming for most people in the empire to devote a lot of time to this. St. Augustine actually is a very interesting figure to talk about this because Augustine came from a relatively wealthy family and he began on this educational track in a way that was supposed to provide him with basic training, but Augustine showed himself to be absolutely brilliant. I mean, an incredibly gifted student, incredibly gifted performer and crafter of rhetorical compositions and speeches. And what this meant was Augustine's father decided that Augustine needed to do more than just go to school in his own sort of third rate hometown. He wanted Augustine to get an even better education, the best education that was possible. And so his father took out loans, made arrangements with other people, and spent a lot of his resources to send Augustine to the best cities, the best schools, the best things that he could access. And so the education that Augustine had was a first rate education, and it was expensive. And a lot of students who began this kind of education didn't finish it. But even those who didn't finish it had a kind of bond with their fellow students. This is because when you went to these kinds of schools, there were all sorts of things that built relationships and encouraged you to build relationships with the other people you were studying with. Um, and so what that meant was you would go to school, but you would also go to parties. You would also have communal events with your fellow students. And you would, over the course of the years that you were studying, build relationships that would last a lifetime. And these relationships, if you were really a member of the elite, if you were someone like Augustine who was going to a major educational center, these relationships would bind people from all kinds of different regions across the empire. And you would have a shared language. You would have a shared set of ways of expressing yourself that you learned in these schools. And perhaps more importantly, you would have a shared cultural outlook. And this is the sort of thing that Ammianus is really talking about. Ammianus believed, like everybody who has this cultural background, believed that this literary education marked you as an elite. And when letters were sent from one elite to another saying that a third person, the person carrying this letter, belongs to our club, he has the background that we all have, the expectation was that you would be accepted as a peer. And Ammianus's complaint about the treatment of people at houses in the city of Rome, especially the treatment of cultured people, Ammianus's complaint is that this shared elite status is not being recognized at Rome. In a sense, everybody who comes with one of these letters saying, this person is cultured, this person is cultivated, they should be accorded the same kind of respect that a peer, someone who shares the host's culture, should receive. But Ammianus says that isn't what happens in Rome. So when, for example, you are brought on as one of the associates of one of these prominent Roman senators, and you're invited to a dinner party, it's a matter of debate who is actually owed a return of hospitality, and if you are having a dinner party, whether anyone from abroad should be invited. But if it is decided that somebody from abroad will be invited, the man who is asked will be the one who haunts the houses of the racing drivers, because men of learning and sobriety are shunned as bringers of bad luck. And so Ammianus's complaint resonates because what he's saying is this deal, this kind of cultural currency that's supposed to be easily recognized everywhere across the empire is not being recognized in Rome. And these ideas this is a problem if this critique actually holds. Because what Ammianus is saying is this cultural system that everybody has bought into should hold. It should be something that everybody observes. And everywhere in the Roman world, elites knew that in principle, they were supposed to treat people with a similar education as equals. And this is something that the Roman schools themselves taught. They taught this etiquette very carefully to the students who enrolled in them. So the school was headed by a professor, and depending upon the level of his students, he taught somewhat differently. The education began as a series of memorization exercises. So you memorize speeches, rules of composition, stories about appropriate behavior, and if you couldn't remember something and you were a young student, the professor could beat you until you did remember it. As students got older and advanced to higher levels of study, the beatings stopped, in part because the students could hit back, and embarrassment became the main motivating factor. So a teacher of philosophy whose students were in their 20s would never ever think to beat a student for not preparing for class, but he certainly would think about embarrassing him. And we have actually notes like lecture notes that are taken in some of these classes where you see the professor actually doing this kind of thing. A student asks a stupid question and the professor attacks him and makes it clear to everybody that the student has asked a stupid question. Eventually, professors are trained students are trained to think of their professors as father figures. And there are actually texts that talk about the father bringing a student to a teacher and the father basically saying, I am turning this person over to you. And the family relationship is going to be superseded by this professor-student relationship. So we have a Platonic philosophical text that says that the biological parentage of somebody and the intellectual parentage of somebody are not even equal. The intellectual parentage is more important than the biological parentage. Now, of course, the text would say this, but the relationships between professors and students are real and they are important. These letters of recommendation that introduce people from abroad to intellectuals and to cultured people and to important figures in new cities, many of these come from the professors, from their professors. And the professors are in many ways judged based on the quality of the placements that they can earn for their students. So professors would set up relationships with patrons when a student went to a new city. They would work with parents to try to find jobs for the students. They would even bail students out of jail if that was necessary. But the students of an individual professor were expected to be loyal to that professor. And so we see from texts that talk about the educational environment that these students were organized into corps. Corps sort of like classes, like freshmen, sophomores, etc. But these corps were also, in a way, kind of militarized almost. And each of them was headed by a best boy. And the corps, in many ways, were like a fraternity. So the student identified with his corps of fellow students in a very real way. And we have letters from students to other students that speak about their classmates and members of their student group as their brothers. And so the school then was like a sort of family. And Libanius, the sophist in Antioch, who was friends with Ammianus, Libanius describes how this environment worked. He said that from the time he was a boy, he'd heard tales of fighting between schools, which took place in the heart of Athens, and I'd heard of cudgels and knives and stones that were used to raise the prestige of their teacher. And I used to think them noble and no less justified than those who took up arms for their country. What he means by this is that these corps of students would actually fight with one another on behalf of the honor of their teacher. So in a sense, we can imagine this as like Harvard fighting Yale, except instead of at a football game, they actually just kind of battle in the streets to talk about the prestige of the school. Libanius then continues. He says, I used to actually pray that it would be my lot to distinguish myself in this way, to go to the Piraeus or Sunion or some other port and kidnap students at their landing, and then go once more to Corinth to stand trial for the kidnapping, and give a string of parties and run through all of my money, and then look at someone to make me a loan. And so what Libanius is talking about is a student culture that goes beyond studying. And what he's talking about is well documented in other sources. When students arrive in Athens, there are multiple teachers who are there. There's not just one University of Athens. There's multiple teachers running their own schools. And there's a competition by those teachers to get students to go to the school. And so when the ship lands, there is often an agreement or an arrangement between a captain and a professor to have the students who come on that ship to Athens captured and taken to that professor so that they can agree to study under that professor and not another one. Sometimes this goes wrong. Sometimes when the students are kidnapped and they are brought to the professor to try to be made to agree to study with him, they say, I've been kidnapped, I don't like this. And sometimes they even will file a complaint with the governor of the province, who is based in the city of Corinth. And then the students who did the kidnapping have to go to Corinth and stand trial for what they have done. And their professor often will come and give their defense speech. Very seldom is anyone actually punished for this kind of thing. And you have to imagine that the governors of Corinth have the same attitude towards this as, like, the police chief in a college town during the big spring party that they hold. So, sort of, if the police chief of UCSD was supposed to be responding to things that happened at Sun God, he would know there's a lot of crazy things that are happening. It's the same thing here. When these ships discharge students into Athens, there's going to be a lot of crazy things that are happening. But the craziness is part of what builds the community. Now, once you joined a school in Athens, and once you joined a school in other places as well, there was an initiation. And the initiation was in some ways similar to what Plutarch describes when he talks about the initiation into a mystery cult. But this isn't a mystery cult. This is an initiation into a cultural environment. And so the initiation is described by both pagans and Christians. Gregory Nazianzen is a Christian, and he describes this event as follows. The student who has agreed to study under the teacher is brought into the Athenian agora, and he's mocked by everyone who wants to do so, with the intention of reducing his conceit and bringing him into submission. And next he's conducted in procession through the marketplace to the bath. And this seems very fearful and brutal to those who don't know what's going on, but to those who have experienced it, it's quite pleasant and humane, for all of the threats yelled at this student are for show rather than real. When they reach the bath, the pagan historian Olympiodorus of Thebes continues, all of the novice, both advanced and beginning students, are led in, and those of their number who are the right age and are ready for the tribon, the special cloak that students and scholars wear, they're pushed to the front of the crowd by those scholars who are leading them. And then, while some rush forward and block their way, others push them from behind. And all of those who block them scream, "Stop, stop, don't bathe." But in the end, they do bathe. And after that, they belong to this elite cultural group. And so the purpose of all of this is to create a distinction that marks people with this educational background and with this cultural training from everybody else, from the people who don't have it. It's the same kind of way of creating a distinction that we saw in the discussion of mystery cults, except this is a completely secular cult. It's a cult of knowledge. It's a cult of cultural prestige. It's a cult of education, but a very specific type of education. And everybody who has been initiated into this kind of cultural environment has something that is valuable. And they all expect that others who have a similar initiation will value it. And so this is why Ammianus is so upset about the treatment of intellectuals in Rome. Because the people who are mistreating these intellectuals should know why they're valuable. They share this initiation into this cultural cult, into this idea of the cultivated, into this idea of the people in the Roman elite who make the empire work. And when this is not acknowledged, it undercuts the things that build connections between that elite. It undercuts the things that make this unified Roman Empire actually unified. The things that make someone in Syria and someone in Italy able to understand where each other is coming from and value the sorts of things that they have achieved. Now, for Christians, this elite culture represents a different sort of problem. Cultural elites are bound primarily by their social ties, and their education is based upon treating and creating ways in which these social bonds will exist. And both Christians and pagans share these social ties. The fact that Gregory Nazianzen and Olympiodorus of Thebes both can describe the same ritual, one a Christian, one a pagan, both of them valuing this ritual and the kind of community it creates, shows that this is a cultural environment and a set of cultural achievements that are supposed to be valued by everyone, both pagan and Christian. But there is a bit of an issue, because this culture is based upon the study of classical texts, many of which talk about the gods, many of which come from a pre-Christian environment, many of which emphasize a kind of religious behavior that Christians don't participate in and don't really agree with. But for all that Christianity was and for all that it achieved in the fourth century, it could not at that moment describe itself as being particularly full of a well-developed literary culture, because Christian writings at that time revolved around the Bible. And people with the kind of cultural background and training that people educated in these schools had looked at the Bible and often saw it not measuring up. So Augustine, for example, famously said that he became very interested in trying to figure out what some teachings that were actually true were. And so he set to his mind to examine the Holy Scriptures and see what kind of books they were. And when he read them, he saw that they were quite unworthy of comparison with the stately prose of Cicero, because Augustine says, I had too much conceit to accept their simplicity, and not enough insight to penetrate their depths. So Augustine is writing as a Christian looking back on this text. And what he's saying is, as someone who was educated in these schools, and as somebody with this intense experience of and value for classical learning and classical literature, that was what he thought good literature was. Literature that was meaningful was written nicely. It was written in sort of beautiful ways. It was written with the powerful compositional style of Cicero. And the Bible simply wasn't. The Bible Augustine is reading is not even the Vulgate. It's a Latin translation of the Greek original of the New Testament. And the Latin translation that he had was pretty terrible. It did not read well. It was something that captured the sense of the work, but it didn't even capture the linguistic complexity of the original Greek. And that Greek is itself not particularly stylized or elevated in the way that it's framed. And so Augustine's response here is kind of typical of the Christian response to elite culture. There's an ambiguity about it. They're somewhat self-conscious of the simplicity of the core literary texts that they use. And so there is a tendency by some Christians to try to take Scripture and add complexity to it, to make Scripture something of a kind of intellectual mystery, something that isn't something you read at face value, but something that requires you to interpret it and to understand it against a deeper and more complicated system of thought. And this is on one level, of course, appealing. And this is what Augustine is saying. Augustine is saying that the Scriptures actually have a lot more to it than the superficial reading suggests. And I was too arrogant at that point when I first picked them up to understand that you needed to think about what Scripture meant to understand the depth of what it actually contained. But there is a risk in saying, well, there is this great depth to Scripture that requires extensive interpretation. And the risk, of course, is where Arius went with it. You take a non-Christian, or you take a pagan or philosophical or Platonic approach to explaining Scripture, and you import a whole lot of ideas that were not originally there. And by importing those ideas, you may create problems with what people understand God to be. This is Arius's big mistake, or the big challenge that Arius posed. But at the same time, Christians kept going to school. They kept getting traditional education. And Gregory Nazianzen, for example, who describes the initiation ritual in Athens to us, was a Christian and a future bishop of Constantinople. And despite their discomfort at the fact that Christian traditions and classical learning may create conflicts, both Augustine and St. Jerome had a classical education as well. And there's one case that we can look at that shows how important it was for Christians when a Christian thinker did these things right. When a Christian thinker was able to take the cultural legacy of the classical world and apply it to the explication of Scripture in a way that was both consistent with with what Christians understood Scripture to say, and also sophisticated enough that somebody with the educational background of somebody like Augustine or Jerome could see this and say, this does make sense, both on a Christian level and on an elite cultural level. And so one person who does this is Victorinus. And Augustine describes Victorinus like this. Victorinus was a pagan philosopher, a pagan devotee of Plato. And at one point, Victorinus converted to Christianity and decided to make this known to everybody. And so Victorinus mounted the platform when he was going to announce his conversion. And everybody who knew this, everybody who knew him, joyfully whispered his name to their neighbors. And there could hardly have been any who did not know who he was. And the hushed voices of the whole congregation then joined in the murmur, Victorinus, Victorinus, Victorinus. And they were quick to let their joy be heard when they saw him, but just as quickly came a hush as they waited for him to speak. And he made his declaration of the true faith with splendid confidence, and all would gladly have seized him in their arms and clutched him to their hearts when they saw this. Now, Victorinus' conversion is something that's really important because Christians who had a traditional literary culture and were devoted to the teachings of the church struggled to make those two things really come together. They were devoted to both. They valued both. And they were looking for some way to be able to do both of those without any kind of conflict seeming like it needed to be explained or even something that are even worried about. And so in Victorinus, who is one of the leading intellectuals and scholars of Platonic ideas in the 4th century Latin world, comes forward and says, I am a Christian, and Christianity is perfectly coherent with the cultural traditions I value. This is a shot in the arm to all of the people who share this cultural background with Victorinus, but cannot, like Victorinus, explain how these things all add up. They trust that he can. And for a lot of the rest of his life, that's what Victorinus does. Now, another figure who is of great interest in light of this is the teacher Proarisius. He too is a Christian. He's based in the city of Athens. And what we see with Proarisius is a figure who, again, is completely able to combine incredible achievement on the highest levels of traditional culture with true, honest, and explicit Christianity. And we know that the Emperor Constans rewarded both Victorinus and Proarisius, but especially Proarisius. And Proarisius was given the ability to speak before the emperor. He was given rewards. A statue was erected in the city of Rome in his honor. And all of the enthusiasm for Victorinus, a Latin speaker, and Proarisius, a Greek speaker, came about because these were people who said you can have both. You can have pious Christianity and the elite culture that is so valuable to you. At the same time, though, some Christians reacted against this. And their opposition came from a number of different directions. One direction was that a lot of this educational achievement was something that people did both because they valued the elite training that they got, but also because this was an easy way to get positions in imperial administration and to join that administrative class of the empire that Diocletian and Constantine had created. And so this education was not just a way to make yourself valuable on a cultural level, it also was something you could monetize and you could get good jobs from. And so this made some Christians suspicious of its value. But there was an even more important move within Christianity that centered on a withdrawal from the rewards of the world, but also the kinds of achievements that were tied directly to them. And the people leading this movement were monks, or as they were called at that time, ascetics. Now, ascetics took their name from the Greek word ascesis, which means basically training. Before asceticism, before Christian asceticism, this was a kind of word that you would use for like athletes who were in extensive training to prepare for athletic events or competitions. But basically, what we have to understand in the 4th century is that these ascetics were people who disengaged from the world. And they disengaged from the world and then trained their body and mind to resist worldly temptations that might draw them back into the world. And so they devote their life to the very specific service of God. And the prototypical ascetic of the mid 4th century was an Egyptian named Antony. And it was his biography that really brought this phenomenon into the popular eye. Now, Antony is a very interesting figure because we know of Antony primarily, I mean, not exclusively, but primarily from a biography written of him by Athanasius, the Nicene bishop of the city of Alexandria. And Athanasius wrote this text a few years after Antony died. But in it, what Athanasius does is he uses the career of Antony as a way to offer an alternative to the entire path that elites had taken. This path that brought you through elite schools, got you into jobs in the empire, and made you a part of this kind of hybrid elite group that could be Christian, but also had these strong attachments to both the world and classical traditions. And what Athanasius does is he begins the text by describing Antony as someone who could have done these things. Athanasius's Antony begins life as somebody who is from a wealthy family, who is a member of a member of a family that belongs to the city council of his hometown. He has property. But from the very outset, instead of going to school like Augustine or Gregory Nazianzen or Libanius, Antony refuses to even learn how to read. Antony refuses to engage with this culture in any fashion whatsoever. Instead, he learns the Bible and only the Bible. And then he moves out from his home. He moves out from his hometown, he moves out into the desert, and he separates himself entirely from society. What Athanasius has done then is charted a completely different way of being a member of the influential elite in the empire. Because Antony wants none of the conventional things that the people who go to these schools want. He doesn't want to have relationships with patrons in other cities. He doesn't want to have a government job. He doesn't want to participate in these hazing activities. He doesn't want to be part of a cohort of other students. He doesn't want to have a network that joins him to elites all across the empire. He doesn't even want to know how to read. What Antony wants to do instead is serve God and only serve God. And Athanasius frames his entire pursuit of and developing skills in asceticism as something that distances Antony from those achievements, those worldly achievements that the system and all of the values that elites had been taught to cherish emphasize. Antony is doing something different. It's something very different. But what Athanasius says is even if you do something different like Antony, you acquire skills that are transferable and superior. Because Athanasius' Antony engages with emperors. He provides advice to Constantius. He writes letters to people in power. He influences policy in a way that elites with this kind of conventional education could only dream of doing. And Athanasius says he also engages with pagan philosophers. And this is a key part of the entire text because this sets up a contrast and a contest between the wisdom that Antony achieves through the study of Christianity and practical asceticism and the wisdom that supposedly comes from this elite culture. So a group of pagan philosophers come to Antony and they begin speaking with him. And Antony said to them, okay, so you want to have a discussion. Why do you want to have a discussion? And they start making fun of him because he can't read. And they, of course, think that they're superior to him because everything in their education suggests this, that somebody who can't read cannot engage in argument on the same level as somebody who has been trained in the educational system of the Roman world. And so when they start making fun of him, Antony says, okay, well, what do you say? What comes first, the mind or letters? And which is the cause of which? Is mind the cause of letters, or are letters the cause of mind? And when they answered that mind is first and the inventor of letters, Antony said, well, whoever then has a sound mind has no need of letters. And this answer amazed both the bystanders and the philosophers. And the philosophers departed, marveling that they had seen so much understanding in a supposedly ignorant man. This is an exchange that contrasts the practical, spiritually infused wisdom of Antony with the conceit and the artificial wisdom of the philosophers. And Athanasius tells us this story particularly so that he can emphasize the superiority of this new and different kind of training. What Athanasius is doing by telling you this is he is creating a conception of a new kind of elite, an ascetic elite that gets to this elite status out of Christian piety and out of devotion to Christian practice. It is not an elite of letters. It is not a community of educated men. It's a community of Christian practitioners. And this is very important. And what we'll see in a couple of lectures is the kind of reception that this idea has. But I think it's important to wrap back up to this question of decline and fall. What you see here are a lot of indications of alternative ways of thinking about cultural achievement in the 4th century. Ammianus gives you a straightforward narrative of cultural decline, where elites are not valuing people who are cultured in the way that they're supposed to. But of course, we need to take that with some qualification, because Ammianus is saying these things to people who are actively valuing the very thing that he says no one values. He's, in a sense, enhancing his audience's sense that they are doing something right and that the people around them are doing something wrong. And therefore, the audience is more valuable, more honest, and more honorable than these other people who value dancers instead of intellectuals. So Ammianus's critique is something that read straightforwardly does suggest there is a cultural decline in the 4th century. But even if you scratch the surface just a little bit, you see it's a lot more complicated, and the very fact that Ammianus is saying this in this way to these people actually suggests that something of the opposite might be happening. With the sources that talk about education, both the Christian and the pagan sources like Gregory and Olympiodorus and Libanius, what we see is a clear valuing of this education, and a valuing of this education not just because of what it teaches, but because of the community it creates. And that community for all of the 4th century remains really vital and really vibrant, and it matters greatly. It is probably above all else, the thing that brings the elites of the empire together and creates an Mediterranean-wide Roman elite that values each other, communicates with each other, and has relationships with each other that extend all the way across this vast empire. But there is the critique of Athanasius. And the critique of Athanasius is something genuinely new. What you have here for the first time is somebody saying this entire value structure can be disregarded, and there's something better that can take its place. What Athanasius is saying in essence is we need to walk away from this structure that has been working. And there is an alternative, and people should consider embracing that alternative. Now, the consequences of what Athanasius is talking about are really significant, because for the first time in the 4th century, you have the creation of something that is a completely different and separate track to a kind of cultural achievement. Because what Athanasius describes Antony doing is philosophy. He doesn't say this is Christian asceticism. He says this is philosophy. And it's a whole different sort of philosophy. But because of that, people who might have been philosophically inclined and would pursue education in the schools now have an alternative. And this is consequential, and it does make a real difference.